He's an orphan, 12 years old, no mother, no father, no home to call his own. His family's business has been sold off by relatives who barely looked him in the eye. He is shipped to a boarding school where the other boys tease him for his religion and treat him like an outsider. You would think a kid like that, with no money, no connections, and no safety net, could never build one of the most iconic luxury brands in human history, right? Well, Hans Wilsdorf managed to create Rolex, a company now valued somewhere between $80 billion and $100 billion. He revolutionized the wristwatch, invented the first waterproof timepiece, and built a brand so powerful that its name alone has become synonymous with success, achievement, and excellence. And he did it all starting from absolutely nothing. So how did an orphaned boy from a small Bavarian town become the man behind the most recognized watch on Earth? To find out, we have to go back to 1881. Hans Eberhard Wilhelm Wilsdorf was born on March 22nd, 1881, in the small town of Kulmbach, in the Franconia region of Bavaria, Germany. His parents, Anna Meisel and Johann Daniel Ferdinand Wilsdorf, owned a modest but successful iron tools business that had been passed down from his grandfather. It was the kind of small-town enterprise that kept a family comfortable, not wealthy, but stable. For a brief window of time, young Hans had what you might call a normal childhood. He had an older brother named Karl and a younger sister named Anna. The family was Protestant, comfortable, and deeply rooted in the traditions of their small Bavarian community. There is a photograph from 1887 showing 6-year-old Hans standing with his family, his parents flanking the 3 children, everyone dressed in their finest clothes. It is the picture of a family that expects the future to be kind. But that stability would shatter before Hans even reached his teenage years. His mother fell ill and died on March 27, 1892, at just 36 years old. Hans was 11. And if that was not devastating enough, his father followed her to the grave just 18 months later, passing away on October 16, 1893, at the age of 47 in the nearby city of Bayreuth. Hans was 12. In the span of roughly 18 months, he had lost both of his parents. He later wrote with painful simplicity, "My mother's early death was soon followed by that of my father's, and at age 12, I was an orphan." Sit with that for a moment. 12 years old, both parents gone, and instead of being embraced by extended family, Hans and his siblings were handed over to their mother's brothers, uncles, who promptly made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his entire life. They sold the family business, the iron tools company that had been in the Wilsdorf name for generations. They took the proceeds and used some of it to send the 3 children to a prestigious boarding school called Ernestinum Coburg in Bavaria. The rest of the money was placed into a trust, completely out of Hans's reach until he became an adult. At first, Hans hated the decision. He was uprooted from everything he knew and dropped into a new town where he was a stranger. The other boys at school teased him because of his Protestant faith in a predominantly Catholic region. He felt isolated, alone, and profoundly depressed. But rather than crumble under the weight of it all, Hans did something that would define the rest of his life. He threw himself into his studies. He poured every ounce of frustration, grief, and loneliness into his schoolwork. And in doing so, he discovered something about himself that would prove to be priceless. He had a remarkable gift for mathematics and languages. These were not just passing interests. Hans became fluent in German, French, and English, a trilingual ability that would open doors no amount of money could have purchased. Years later, looking back on those brutal early years, Hans would reflect with surprising gratitude. He wrote, "Our uncles were not indifferent to our fate. Nevertheless, the way in which they made me become self-reliant very early in life, made me acquire the habit of looking after my possessions, and looking back, I believe that it is to this that much of my success is due. The very thing that seemed like abandonment, being stripped of family, wealth, and security at the age of 12, became the forge that shaped his character. The loneliness made him fiercely independent. The hardship made him relentless. And the early self-reliance gave him a confidence that bordered on audacity. It was at boarding school that Hans also met a young Swiss student who would unknowingly change the direction of his entire life. This friend introduced him to the world of Swiss industry and planted a seed in Hans's mind about the possibilities that awaited across the border. It was a small connection, the kind of casual friendship that forms in school hallways, but it would end up being the bridge between a grieving orphan in Bavaria and the watchmaking capital of the world. After finishing his education, Hans took an apprenticeship with a company that exported pearls. It wasn't glamorous work by any stretch of the imagination, but it taught him the fundamentals of international commerce, how goods moved across borders, how currencies fluctuated, how to negotiate deals in multiple languages, and how to present yourself with confidence, even when you had nothing behind you but grit. And then, in 1900, at just 19 years old, Hans made a move that would change everything. He packed his bags and traveled to La Chaux-de-Fonds, Switzerland, the beating heart of the Swiss watchmaking industry. He landed a job as a clerk, an English correspondent, with a watch exporting firm called Kuno Korten, located at 49 Rue Leopold Robert. His salary was a modest 80 Swiss francs per month. His daily work was about as unglamorous as it gets. He wound hundreds of pocket watches every single day, checked each one for accuracy, and handled business correspondence in 3 languages. Most young men would have seen this as a dead-end clerical job. But Hans was not most young men. He was studying the industry from the inside, absorbing every detail about movements, escapements, precision engineering, and the delicate art of Swiss watchmaking. He learned how watches were assembled, what separated a good movement from a great one, and how the international watch trade operated at every level. And during those years at Kuno Korten, Hans became aware of something that almost nobody else in the industry was paying attention to. In the nearby Swiss town of Bienne, there was a small movement manufacturer called Igler. They were making something that the watch establishment considered almost laughable: tiny ébauche movements with lever escapements, small enough to fit inside a wristwatch. Most watchmakers dismissed these miniature movements as novelties, too small to be accurate, too fragile to be practical. But Hans Wilsdorf looked at those tiny Egler movements and saw something that literally no one else could see. He saw the future. You see, in the early 1900s, the pocket watch was king. It was the undisputed standard of personal timekeeping. Men carried them proudly in their vest pockets with elegant chains and fobs. A fine pocket watch was a status symbol, a mark of sophistication and masculinity. Wristwatches, on the other hand, were considered feminine accessories. They were called wristlets, and they were seen as delicate jewelry for women, nothing more. If a man wore a watch on his wrist, he'd be laughed at. Hans later recalled in his autobiography, published in 1948, that in those days a wristwatch was considered a joke. The few who wore them were laughed at. People said a watch with such a tiny, delicate mechanism could never withstand the violent gestures of hand and arm, and of course, it was too small to be accurate. But Hans was absolutely, unshakably convinced that the wristwatch would eventually replace the pocket watch entirely. He wrote in 1914 that his personal opinion was that pocket watches would almost completely disappear, and that wristwatches would replace them definitively. He said he was not mistaken in this opinion. And you will see that I am right. I mean, the confidence, the sheer audacity. The entire watchmaking industry was dismissing wristwatches as toys, and this orphan from Bavaria was betting his entire future on them. That takes a level of conviction that most of us can barely comprehend. In 1903, Hans moved to London, England, to work for another watch company. London at that time was the commercial capital of the world, the hub of the British Empire, a city where fortunes were made and lost every day. For a young man with nothing but talent and ambition, it was the perfect arena. But by this point, working for someone else simply was not going to satisfy Hans Wilsdorf. He had spent years absorbing the watch industry's inner workings, and he had a vision that burned brighter with every passing month. Not anymore. He was done being a clerk. In 1905, at the age of just 24, Hans partnered with his brother-in-law, Alfred James Davis, who was considerably older and more experienced in business. Davis believed deeply in Hans's passion and judgment, enough to invest his own capital into the venture. Together, they established a company called Wilsdorf and Davis in London. Their business model was straightforward. They imported Swiss movements from Hermann Egler in Bienne and placed them into high-quality watch cases made in England. These watches were then sold to jewelers throughout the British Empire, who would stamp their own names on the dials. It was a common practice at the time, and it made Wilsdorf and Davis very competitive very quickly. However, Hans had a vision that went far beyond simply being an anonymous watch importer. He wanted to create something the industry had never seen. He wanted a brand. At a time when the importer's name was invisible to the end customer, Hans wanted a name that people would recognize and trust, a name that would appear on the dial of every watch they sold. He spent months obsessing over this, going through hundreds of combinations of letters, trying to find the perfect word. And then one morning in 1908, while riding a horse-drawn double-decker omnibus through the Cheapside district of London, it happened. As Hans described it decades later at Rolex's 50th anniversary, he tried combining the letters of the alphabet in every possible way. This gave some 100 names, but none of them felt quite right. It was one morning when he was sitting on the upper level of a double-decker powered at that time by horses, driving along Cheapside in London, that a good genie whispered in his ear, "Rolex." Whether you believe in genies or creative inspiration, the name was nothing short of perfect. It was short, melodic, easy to pronounce in virtually any European language, impossible to misspell, and compact enough to fit cleanly on a watch dial alongside the jeweler's name. On July 2nd, 1908, Hans officially registered Rolex as a trademark in La Chaux-de-Fonds. But having a catchy name was not enough, not even close. Hans understood that to make the wristwatch legitimate in a world dominated by pocket watches, he needed to destroy the myth that small movements could not keep accurate time. So in 1910, he sent a Rolex wristwatch to the official watch rating center in Bienne, and it came back with the Swiss certificate of chronometric precision. It was the first wristwatch in history to receive this honor. The industry was genuinely stunned, but Hans was not done, not by a long shot. He wanted to silence every last skeptic, every watchmaker who sneered at the wristwatch, every gentleman who still insisted that pocket watches were the only serious timepiece. In 1914, he submitted a small Rolex wristwatch to the Kew Observatory in Great Britain, the most prestigious and demanding testing institution in the entire world. You have to understand what Kew represented. This was the institution responsible for certifying marine chronometers for the Royal Navy, the precision instruments that ships depended on for navigation across open oceans. Getting it wrong by more than a few seconds per day could mean the difference between reaching port safely and running aground on rocks in the middle of the night. The Kew Observatory subjected watches to 45 grueling days of continuous testing across 5 different positions and 3 extreme temperatures, from ice cold to oven hot to ambient. No wristwatch had ever even been submitted for this test, let alone passed it. The idea was considered laughable. On July 15, 1914, that tiny Rolex wristwatch became the first in history to receive the Class A certificate from Kew. It recorded an average daily deviation of just 1 second per day. 1 second. At a time when the entire industry said wristwatches were inaccurate trinkets, unfit for serious use, Hans Wilsdorf had proven they could rival the finest navigation instruments on the planet. He later called it a red-letter day he would never forget. And this is where things would take a dramatic turn. Just 13 days after that monumental Kew certification, on July 28, 1914, World War I erupted. For Hans Wilsdorf, a German-born man living in London with a decidedly German name and accent, the war brought a devastating new problem. Anti-German sentiment swept through Britain like wildfire. People with German names were harassed, their businesses boycotted, their loyalty questioned. However, the war would also validate Hans's vision in the most unexpected and tragic way possible. Trench warfare changed everything about how men used watches. Soldiers in the muddy, chaotic trenches of the Western Front needed to check the time constantly, to coordinate attacks, to synchronize artillery barrages with infantry advances, to know exactly when to go over the top. The military tactic called the creeping barrage, first used at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, required infantry to advance just behind a moving wall of artillery fire. If your timing was off by even a few minutes, your own artillery would kill you, and trying to fish a pocket watch out of your coat while holding a rifle, dodging bullets, and crawling through mud simply was not an option. Wristwatches went from being a feminine accessory to a life-or-death military necessity almost overnight. A 1916 military handbook called Knowledge for War listed a luminous wristwatch with unbreakable glass as the very first item in an officer's kit, ranked ahead of even a revolver and field glasses. Think about that. A wristwatch was considered more essential than a weapon. By 1916, roughly a quarter of all soldiers were wearing them, and the watch industry, which had mocked Hans for years, suddenly could not produce wristwatches fast enough. Companies like Omega, Longines, and yes, Rolex, were manufacturing trench watches as fast as the machinery would allow. When millions of battle-hardened soldiers returned home after the armistice in 1918, they kept wearing their wristwatches. The masculine stigma was obliterated. The pocket watch era was over. By the 1930s, wristwatches were outselling pocket watches by a staggering 50-1. The bet that everyone told Hans Wilsdorf was foolish had paid off in the most profound and tragic way imaginable. But the war created serious business problems too. In 1915, the British government slapped a 33% customs duty on imported luxury goods, including watches. For a company that relied entirely on importing Swiss movements, this was potentially fatal. Hans made the difficult decision to move Rolex's export operations to Bienne, Switzerland. By 1919, he relocated the entire headquarters to Geneva, where it remains to this day. He also changed the company name to the Rolex Watch Company. Partly, this was strategic branding, but there was another truth underneath. The name Wilsdorf was unmistakably German, and in post-war Europe, a German name on a luxury product was a serious liability. By 1914, Rolex already had more than 60 employees in London, and the company was thriving. Walking away from that could not have been easy. But Hans Wilsdorf had never chosen the easy path. Now established in Geneva, Hans confronted the next great challenge of his career: The wristwatch had conquered the accuracy problem. Soldiers had proven it was practical and masculine. Sales were growing steadily, but there was one fatal flaw that kept Hans up at night. Wristwatches were incredibly vulnerable to the elements. Dust, moisture, and water could seep into the case through tiny gaps and absolutely destroy the delicate movement inside. A single rainy afternoon could ruin a watch that took weeks to assemble. And unlike pocket watches, which lived safely inside vest pockets, wristwatches were exposed to the world every moment of every day. Hans became obsessed with solving this problem. For over a decade, he worked tirelessly with casemakers, engineers, and patent attorneys to develop something that had never existed before: a watch case that was completely and permanently sealed from the outside world. He filed and acquired a series of patents between 1922 and 1925, painstakingly working out the engineering challenges that had defeated every other watchmaker who had attempted water resistance. Previous attempts involved bulky double-case designs that made watches thick and unwieldy. Hans wanted something elegant, something that did not sacrifice form for function. And in 1926, after years of painstaking development, Rolex unveiled the Oyster. It was the world's first truly waterproof wristwatch. The case featured a revolutionary three-piece design with a screw-down bezel, a screw-down case back, and most importantly, a patented screw-down crown that sealed the winding mechanism from water, dust, and dirt. The key breakthrough was the internal clutch mechanism in the crown, which allowed it to be screwed down tightly against the case even when the watch was fully wound. It was hermetically sealed, impervious to the elements, like the shell of an oyster. Hence the name Oyster. But here was the problem with making a claim as bold as waterproof. People do not just take your word for it. They are skeptical, deeply skeptical. Especially in the 1920s, when the idea of submerging a delicate mechanical watch in water sounded completely insane. You could run advertisements all day long claiming your watch was waterproof, but without dramatic proof, nobody was going to believe you. Rolex actually distributed special aquarium-shaped display cases to watch retailers, featuring a Rolex Oyster submerged in water right there in the shop window. It was clever, but Hans needed something bigger, something the whole world would notice. And this is where his marketing genius, which I would argue was decades ahead of literally anyone else in the industry, kicked into overdrive. In October of 1927, a young English swimmer named Mercedes Gleitzer made headlines across Britain. On October 7th, she successfully swam the English Channel, completing the 21-mile crossing from France to England in 15 hours and 15 minutes. She was the first British woman to accomplish this extraordinary feat. But then, just days later, a rival swimmer named Dorothy Logan claimed she had done it faster. Logan's claim was later exposed as a complete fraud, but the damage was done. Public doubt about Gleitzer's achievement had been sown. Gleitzer decided to do a vindication swim on October 21st to prove once and for all that her record was legitimate. Hans Wilsdorf saw his moment. He approached Gleitzer and asked her to wear a Rolex Oyster on a ribbon around her neck during the vindication swim. She agreed. The conditions on October 21st were brutal, with freezing water temperatures as low as 51 degrees Fahrenheit, powerful currents, and bone-chilling cold. A flotilla of boats carrying journalists, family, and even musicians followed Gleitzer as she battled the channel. After more than 10 hours and 24 minutes in the freezing English Channel, Gleitzer had to abandon the attempt due to sheer exhaustion and hypothermia. She did not make it across. But here is the thing. When they pulled Mercedes Gleitzer from the water, the Rolex Oyster around her neck was still ticking perfectly. Not a single drop of water had penetrated the case. The movement was in flawless working order. A few days later, Gleitzer wrote to Rolex with what has become one of the most famous testimonials in advertising history, praising the watch as a reliable and accurate timekeeping companion that survived over 10 hours of complete immersion in freezing seawater. Hans immediately took out a full-page advertisement on the front page of the London Daily Mail on November 24, 1927. The headline declared the wonder watch that defies the elements. The ad featured the oyster perched inside an oyster shell and proclaimed its triumph in the English Channel. This was, by most accounts, the birth of the modern celebrity endorsement. Mercedes Gleitzer became what Rolex called a testimony, decades before the concept of brand ambassadors even existed. Hans Wilsdorf had essentially invented the playbook that luxury brands, sports brands, and tech companies would follow for the next century. He invented influencer marketing about 90 years before anyone created Instagram. The oyster put Rolex on the global map, but Hans still was not satisfied. A waterproof watch was incredible, but every time you unscrewed the crown to wind it manually, you compromised the waterproof seal. Hans wanted a watch that wound itself, eliminating the need to ever touch the crown for daily winding. In 1931, Rolex introduced the perpetual movement, the first practical self-winding mechanism powered by a full 360-degree rotor that harnessed the natural motion of the wearer's wrist. The watch literally powered itself as you moved your arm throughout the day. Combined with the oyster case, this created the Oyster Perpetual, arguably the most important watch platform ever designed, and the foundation upon which virtually every Rolex is still built today. The perpetual rotor mechanism would later become the standard adopted by the entire watch industry. The 1930s and 1940s brought both triumph and deep personal heartbreak for Hans. As the world descended into another global conflict, Rolex's reputation continued to grow in the most unlikely of places. During World War II, Royal Air Force pilots began buying Rolex watches with their own money because the government-issued timepieces were vastly inferior. These pilots trusted their lives to split-second timing, and they trusted Rolex to deliver it. When British officers were captured and sent to prisoner of war camps across occupied Europe, their beloved Rolex watches were often the first things confiscated by the Germans. The watches became prize trophies. When Hans heard about this through letters that found their way to Geneva, he made an offer that speaks volumes about his character and the values he had carried since boyhood. He told captured officers that if they wrote to Rolex and explained their circumstances, he would send them replacement watches immediately, and they would not have to pay until after the war ended. Many officers took him up on this offer. One of these replacement watches, belonging to an officer who was held in Stalag Luft III, the camp that inspired the movie The Great Escape, was later sold at Christie's for $189,000. But then, in 1944, the most devastating blow of Hans's life struck. His beloved wife, Florence Frances May Wilsdorf Crotty, passed away. Hans and Florence had no children together. At 63 years old, he was suddenly alone, a widower with no heirs, and one of the most valuable companies in Switzerland. The loss of Florence forced Hans to confront a question that had been gnawing at the back of his mind for years. What would happen to Rolex after he was gone? Who would protect everything he had built? In 1945, grief-stricken but clear-headed, Hans made a decision that would ensure Rolex's independence in perpetuity. He established the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, a private charitable trust based in Geneva. Then he did something that no one expected. He transferred 100% of his ownership stake in Rolex to the foundation, every single share. This meant that Rolex could never be sold. It could never be acquired by a luxury conglomerate like LVMH or Richemont. It would never answer to outside shareholders demanding higher margins or quarterly earnings growth. The foundation would use Rolex's profits to reinvest in the company and support education, science, and social causes. It was a decision born from the deepest personal loss, but it would become one of the most brilliant and enduring corporate structures in the history of business. With the foundation securing Rolex's future, Hans channeled his energy back into the thing he loved most. The late 1940s and the 1950s became the golden age of Rolex innovation. In 1945, the company released the Datejust, the first self-winding, waterproof wristwatch with an automatic date display. In 1953, members of the British expedition led by Sir John Hunt wore Rolex Oyster perpetual watches as they attempted to climb Mount Everest. On May 29, 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay became the first humans to stand on the summit of the highest mountain on Earth. That same year, Rolex launched the Submariner, the world's first diving watch rated to 100 meters of depth. In 1954, the GMT Master arrived, designed specifically for Pan American World Airways pilots who needed to track multiple time zones simultaneously. In 1956, the Day-Date, which would come to be known as the President, became the first wristwatch in history to display both the date and the full day of the week spelled out on the dial. Each of these watches would become icons. Each would spawn its own culture, its own collectors, its own mythology. The Submariner alone would become arguably the most recognizable dive watch ever created, worn by everyone from Jacques Cousteau to James Bond. The Daytona would go on to become one of the most sought-after collectible watches in history, after actor Paul Newman was photographed wearing one, eventually selling at auction for over $17 million. And every single one of these legendary timepieces was built on the twin pillars that Hans Wilsdorf had spent his lifetime establishing: the waterproof Oyster case and the self-winding perpetual movement. In January of 1960, just months before Hans's death, a specially designed Rolex Deep Sea Special was strapped to the outside of Jacques Piccard's bathyscaphe Trieste as it descended into the Mariana Trench, the deepest point in the world's oceans. The watch survived the crushing pressure and was found to be in perfect working order when it resurfaced. It was as if the universe was offering one final validation of everything Hans Wilsdorf had believed in. Hans Wilsdorf passed away on July 6, 1960, in Geneva, Switzerland. He was 79 years old. He was buried in King's Cemetery in Geneva beside his beloved Florence. The company he built from nothing didn't just survive his death, it thrived. And this is remarkable when you consider where this man started. An orphan at 12, mocked at boarding school for his faith, working as a clerk, winding pocket watches for 80 francs a month in a Swiss watchmaking town, laughed at by an entire industry for believing in a product they considered a feminine novelty, forced to flee his adopted country because of his German heritage during 2 world wars. A man who lost both parents before he was a teenager and lost his wife before he could grow old with her. And yet, through all of that grief and adversity, he built the single most recognized and revered watch brand in human history. A brand that didn't just survive him, it flourished in ways that even he could probably never have imagined. When reflecting on his approach, Wilsdorf once declared, "Only great marketing is needed to make a company successful." But I think that dramatically undersells what he actually accomplished. Yes, Hans was a marketing visionary, arguably the first person to truly understand the power of celebrity endorsements, real-world product demonstrations, and aspirational branding. But he was also an inventor, a perfectionist, and a man who fundamentally understood that no amount of marketing can sustain a mediocre product. He didn't just market watches, he reimagined what a watch could be. Today, Rolex generates over 10 billion Swiss francs in annual revenue. The company manufactures roughly 1.2 million watches per year from facilities in Geneva and Bienne. Industry analysts estimate the company's total value at somewhere between $80 billion and $100 billion. It commands approximately 32% of the entire Swiss luxury watch segment and outsells the next 5 largest brands combined. The Hans Wilsdorf Foundation reportedly donates between 100 million and 150 million Swiss francs annually to charitable causes across Geneva. But Rolex's true legacy is not measured in Swiss francs or market share. It is measured in what one orphaned boy proved to the world. He proved that where you start does not have to determine where you finish. He proved that vision without execution is just a daydream, and that execution without vision is just labor. He proved that the things that break you, the loss, the loneliness, the doubt, can become the very forces that forge you into something extraordinary. The Hans Wilsdorf Foundation still owns and controls Rolex to this day. It does not answer to Wall Street. It does not chase quarterly earnings. It does not cut corners. It simply continues to build the finest watches in the world, exactly as its founder intended, perpetually, just like the self-winding movement inside every Rolex ever made. And that is how an orphan boy from Kulmbach, Germany, who lost everything before he turned 13, created the most iconic watch brand the world has ever known.